Plenary 2 will now begin. Now we will start the second plenary of the 8th Annual Seoul Climate Energy Conference 2021. There will be 2 presentations and a discussion on the topic of achieving Korea's carbon neutrality target. I would like to welcome the moderator of this session, Ji-young, who is co-organizer of the Seoul Climate Energy Conference and head of KAIST Graduate School of Green Growth.
Thank you, Karin. Good morning, everybody. As you know, Korean government has declared carbon neutrality target in October 2020, last year. I think now it's the time to turn this ambitious goal into action. It's my great honor to moderate a session on achieving Korea's carbon neutrality target in this crucial moment with only 28 years left to achieve the target. In this plenary, we plan to discuss concrete energy technology and policy strategies to achieve Korea's carbon neutrality target. And I have organized the plenary around the following questions. What are the enablers and barriers to the carbon neutrality target? And how can we improve the feasibility of Korea's carbon neutrality target? And what will be the necessary policy measures and institutions and investment needs? Here we have distinguished speakers and panelists joining online. Vice Minister of Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, Park Ki-young is joining, and Deputy Minister for Climate Change and Carbon Neutral Policy, Ministry of Environment, Kim Bop-jung is joining us. And the President of Green Technology Center, Jung Byung-gi, is joining. And KAIST Professor of Nuclear and Quantum Engineering, Professor Im Man-sung, is joining here. And Head of Asia Pacific Research, Bloomberg NEF, Ali Izadi, is joining us. And lastly, Managing Director of Solutions for Our Climate, Kim Joo-jin, is joining us. Without further ado, let us hear our first presentation by Vice Minister Park. Vice Minister Park, can you? Okay, so could you start your presentation first?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ki-young Park, the Vice Minister of Trade, Industry and Energy. The 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, closed last month on November 13th. The parties adopted the Glasgow Climate Pact and pledged to ramp up their efforts to achieve carbon neutrality. At the conference, Korea announced its updated NDC to the international community. As the transition to carbon neutrality is well underway, the energy sector is expected to see many changes in the times ahead. In this regard, today I would like to talk about how we should set the direction of energy policy in the age of carbon neutrality. Starting with why the energy system needs to change, I will talk about what actions Korea has been taking to go carbon neutral, and then what direction Korea's energy policy should take. Let me first explain why we need to change the energy system to achieve carbon neutrality. Since the 48th session of UN IPCC in 2018, many countries have scrambled to declare carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality has now become a global new normal that no country can dismiss. As of November this year, 138 countries, including the US, EU, Japan, China, and India, declared carbon neutrality. At the COP26 summit in last November, governments affirmed once again their commitment to achieve carbon neutrality. At the end of 2-week-long discussions, they decided to adopt the Glasgow Climate Pact which has become the first UN climate agreement to explicitly mention the use of coal. They also made voluntary declarations as part of their cross-sector efforts to achieve carbon neutrality. The US and China surprised the COP26 climate summit with a joint declaration. Even amid escalating tension around the economy, trade, and human rights issues between the two countries, they agreed to work together to tackle challenges to addressing climate change. All countries entirely agreed that achieving carbon neutrality is vital to fight climate change and that on the pathway to carbon neutrality, the role of the energy sector is particularly important. These graphs highlight the importance of the energy sector in achieving carbon neutrality. About 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions come from energy use. Each proportion is bigger in Korea, with the energy sector accounting for 87% of the total emissions. On this account, it is not too much to say whether Korea succeeds in realizing carbon neutrality depends crucially on the innovation of the energy system. And now, I will talk about what actions Korea has been taking to work on carbon neutrality. The Korean government and the industry sector have put a lot of effort into the reduction of greenhouse gases in various dimensions. In recent years, the Korean government has been pushing for the transition to clean, safe energy by increasing the share of renewable energy while reducing the share of coal. The government started early to promote emissions reduction in the energy and industry sectors through the introduction of the renewable portfolio standards and the emissions trading scheme. The industry sector, including the steel and cement industries, has been making green investments which have been supported by the government's policy efforts. As a result, Korea has recently seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions despite our continued economic growth. In October 2020, Korea declared that it would join other countries in going carbon neutral by 2050. This year, the Presidential Committee on Carbon Neutrality was established in May to serve as the control tower of the country's emissions reduction plans, and the Framework Act on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth was passed by the National Assembly in August. Korea has now become the 14th country in the world to mandate the carbon neutral goal. At the COP26, Korea also officially introduced its updated NDC that revised its 2030 emissions reduction target to 40% from its previous goal of 26.3%. While other countries, such as the US with at least 50% and EU with at least 55%, have set much higher targets, Korea is expected to be faster in meeting the 2030 target with the largest annual reduction rate. Now, I will move on to discuss the direction of Korea's energy policy in the age of carbon neutrality. First and foremost, Korea will gradually phase out coal-fired power generation and make transition to LNG generation. We also plan to promote the widespread use of carbon-free power sources like ammonia and hydrogen. And we will step up to increase the share of renewables in our energy mix. The Korean government plans to improve licensing-related systems, including the establishment one-stop shop. In addition, Korea will lay the groundwork for expanding the use of renewables by requiring power generation companies to generate a large share of electricity from renewable energy. Korea also will make proactive investments in electric power grids and expand flexible resources like energy storage systems. We will advance more active policies on demand-side management that encourage broader public participation. This includes introduction of energy efficiency target control programs for energy-intensive industries and the extension of energy-saving incentive programs for the general public. The Korean government will take carbon neutrality as an opportunity to create jobs and a new driving force for economic growth. To this end, we will invest in the innovation of breakthrough technologies. The government has increased the next year's budget for carbon neutrality R&D. It also plans to continue putting enormous financial resources into the development, demonstration, and deployment of key clean energy technologies. We will also lay the foundation for the growth of future energy industry. The government will boost hydrogen consumption by providing all-around support in its production, distribution, and use. We also plan to contribute to promote future clean energy technologies like next-generation solar cell technology. Korea also plans to further develop CCUS technology and build a domestic CCUS facility. The budget up to 3 trillion won will be assigned to research projects for CCUS technology over the next decade. We will also work hard to create a new business ecology of the energy industry combined with digital technologies. The Korean government will endeavor to come up with measures to make good use of existing coal and gas energy facilities and to support workforce transition. And it will establish a legal foundation to boost the economy of the most affected regions. Since going carbon neutral cannot be done with one country's efforts alone, Korea will fully cooperate with the international community. Overseas reduction would be an effective means for cutting global total emissions by contributing to emissions reduction of developing countries with greater reduction potential. Therefore, Korea will offer active support for private companies' overseas reductions and for the development of new carbon neutral technologies through bilateral cooperation. The Korean government will announce energy carbon neutral innovation strategy that introduces its long-term vision for energy sector's carbon neutrality and contains all the important points made in this presentation. Now, I'm going to wrap up my speech. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Minister Park, for delivering the perspective and concrete actions from the perspective of the ministry. He has emphasized the three things at the end, and accelerating energy transition through various energy technologies development. And the second one is creating new economic growth engine, and fair, lastly, in the fair and inclusive transition and international cooperation. Because of the time, we will save questions and comments to the last. Now the second presentation, we'll move on to the second presentation, and second presentation is mine. Okay, so while waiting for my slides. Okay, thank you. Let me take this opportunity to introduce, to the best of our knowledge, the first scientific study for Korea's carbon neutrality target, and I have conducted with students from KAIST and researchers from University of Maryland. Next slide. Okay. Next slide, please. I'll do that. Okay. It seems that Korea's carbon lock-in seems significant. This figure shows the left-hand side shows we have been heavily reliant on coal and gas, and nuclear power has played a significant role in providing baseload so far. And then we are targeting carbon neutrality by 2050, which is only 28 years remaining. So we need drastic changes in our energy system. The right-hand side figure shows the age structure of coal plants we have built so far. As you can see, the coal plant stock in Korea is relatively young, and even if we assume no new coal plant introduced from now on, complete phase out of coal power plant would take nearly 25 years at least, which is by the mid-40s. This pace of decarbonization is not at all compatible with our updated NDC target and also our carbon neutrality target at all. Okay, so given these challenges, I should say that Korea's challenge is very unique, as energy transition is now being made for currently carbon-intensive economy with the simultaneous phase-out of coal and nuclear power as an option. Here, my research question are the following. What would Korea's 2050 carbon neutrality target require for a national energy system? And what is the role of the power sector for the transition? And what does the availability of so-called critical mitigation technologies such as carbon capture and storage and nuclear power mean for us? And lastly, what might be the technology strategies to increase the feasibility of the carbon neutrality ambition? To address these questions, these important questions, we developed scenarios spanning key uncertainties associated with the target based on an integrated assessment model called GCAM KAIST 1.0, assessing policy feasibility by contextualizing them with the history. Okay, so we built 4 different scenarios. The first scenario is current policy scenarios, which reflects Korea's current and planned energy and climate policy measures and instruments, and where electricity generation profiles following 9th National Power Supply Plan and then 5th Renewable Energy Basic Plan. And here, the total energy demand and energy consumption of individual end users reflects the 3rd Basic Energy Plan and other sector-specific policy targets, so which is basically reference policy scenario. Now we have 3 other scenarios, which are net zero or carbon neutrality scenario in different forms. The second scenario, called net zero 2050, is actually to implement additional policies to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, in addition to policy instruments employed in current policy scenario. And where the annual greenhouse gas emissions are assumed to decrease linearly until they reach net zero in 2050. The third scenario is nuclear-assisted carbon neutrality scenario, which we call net zero 2050 nuke, which shares the same assumptions as net zero 2050, except that nuclear power expansion is allowed based on its economics. The last scenario is CCS constrained carbon neutrality scenario by 2050, which we call net zero 2050 limited CCS scenario, which shares the same assumption as net zero 2050, except that CCS deployment, which I think is very much important option, that deployment is restricted due to assumed higher capital cost and resource limitations. Here, this figure shows our current the scenario projection of current policy. The red line shows the current policy scenario greenhouse gas emissions pathway over time, and the blue line shows net zero 2050 scenario pathway. as you can see, our current policy instruments and measures are not at all actually fall short of our ambition, our carbon neutrality ambition, by a lot. However, the most recent updated new NDC, National Determined Contribution, of 436 megaton of CO2 equivalent is broadly in line with our carbon neutrality ambition. This figure shows the target the carbon prices pathway that are consistent with our the carbon neutrality ambition. As you can see, compared to net zero 2050 carbon price pathway, when the CCS is constrained, then we will have to have higher carbon price by 2050 through 2050, and when you have nuclear assisted carbon neutrality scenario, then we will have lower carbon prices. However, all these scenarios actually these results suggest that all these scenario is quite challenging and quite costly and quite requires a huge effort for the entire economy. This figure shows the greenhouse gas emissions by scenarios. As you can see, current policy scenario, we have continued decrease in greenhouse gas emissions over time. However, that is not at all the close to zero emissions target by 2050. And then now we have 3 other net zero scenarios, and then they all achieve zero emissions by year 2050 by rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time. There are a couple of findings we got from these results. The one is basically we have still residual greenhouse gas emissions remaining by year 2050, emissions coming from so-called hard-to-abate sectors like agriculture sector and building sector and industry sector. Whereas that residual emission is perfectly offset by negative emission sectors such as land use and forestry and direct air capture technology, which is the future technology of absorbing CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. And also we have negative emissions coming from the power sector. And this huge rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions would require drastic changes in our energy system. As you can see from this primary energy consumption figure, the current policy scenario, we have continued decrease in coal and oil. However, we have continued increase in gas energy sources and also increase in renewable sources. When we have carbon neutrality target in place, we have much rapid reduction in coal and oil and even gas over time, and coal phases out by year 2035, and gas, although we have gas, but gas will remain as a form with carbon capture and storage. And we have also a very rapid increase in renewable sources over time. The most important transformation sector is power sector, and the power sector also experienced drastic changes over time. In current policy scenario, we have relatively stable size of power sector over time, although we have phase out of coal and very rapid increase in gas over time, accounting for about 40% of total power generation by year 2050. In net zero 2050 scenario, we have that the phase out of coal, the accelerated phase out of coal over time, and also the gas. The gas will be installed with carbon capture and storage over time, but renewable sources will account for nearly 60% by year 2050. When this carbon neutrality target is assisted with nuclear power, then we will have much lower share of renewable, about 40% of renewable power generation, and where the nuclear power will account for about 40% of the power mix by year 2050. When the CCS is limited, then the situation is even worse. The situation is that the renewable sources actually accounts for nearly 80% of the total energy system, which is quite challenging scenario. And final energy tells a very similar story, so I will skip this scenario. And then, what would all these scenarios mean for our terrestrial and geological resources? So here, this figure shows our CO2, carbon dioxide sequestration picture for all these net zero scenarios. As you can see, by year 2050, depending upon the availability of critical mitigation technology, we will have to save about 0.6 gigaton of CO2 up to 1.8 gigaton of CO2 by year 2050, which is quite a big resources requirement. And then just for your information, the report by Carbon Neutrality Committee has said that, has suggested that we will need about 1 gigaton of carbon storage site by year 2050. And then when the foreign resources can be combined, then we will have to have secure 2 gigaton of CO2 by year 2050. So this CO2 storage will be critically important limiting factor to our pursuit of carbon neutrality. And so this figure shows actually whether or not our target is feasible enough. This figure shows our capacity expansion over time. This line, the solid line, shows our capacity expansion over time of wind power and nuclear power and solar power. The dotted line shows the expansion rate, the rate of expansion over time. And then the numbers before 2020 is our history, and the numbers after is our scenario results. As we can see, the wind power-wise and nuclear power-wise, the expansion rate is totally in line with our history. So it will not create significant challenges our energy system, at least from the perspective of numbers. However, solar power, you can see all of those scenarios actually will require unprecedentedly rapid expansion in solar power system, except for the nuclear assisted scenarios. And then this requires about, by year 2050, about 3 to 4 times the size of Seoul area, which would create quite a challenging issues in terms of social acceptance. And here the figure shows policy costs over time. As you see, the net zero target requires huge cost to our economy. But nuclear, when the carbon neutrality is assisted with nuclear, then we can significantly reduce our policy cost in the pursuit to carbon neutrality. So here is a summary. The carbon neutrality target requires rapid decarbonization of the energy system over time and incur substantial policy costs. That's for sure. And none is easy for us. Korea's current policies and policy instruments fall short of what its existing 2030 NDC target and recently proposed revision would require. The power sector play a pivotal role in Korea's carbon neutrality transition. And the power sector's rapid decarbonization should be combined with the rapid electrification of the end-use sectors. And coal power phases out by 2030s. In the long term, negative emissions technologies come online in a considerable proportion to offset hard-to-abate emissions from the economy. And economics-based expansion of nuclear power would reduce the need for rapid build-up of renewables and CCS and alleviating the stress on terrestrial and geological system in Korea. Yet, exclusive reliance on renewables without any contribution from nuclear would require unprecedentedly rapid ramp-up of solar power and CCS. This means significantly higher policy costs, a measure of difficulty of achieving carbon neutrality target. So here are two implications. The first, strengthening climate policy is needed to achieve the ambitious carbon neutrality by year 2050. Instruments for the new NDC target need to be urgently but carefully developed to send a credible signal to investors of the country's commitment to carbon neutrality. An emissions cap for KETS need to be declined over time with its long-term schedule announced early on in a way that is compatible with the carbon neutrality target. For sectors currently not covered by KETS, introduction of economy-wide carbon tax that rises over time in line with the KETS allowance price would help achieve carbon neutrality. The second, I think carbon neutrality, in order to achieve carbon neutrality, we need to also guarantee technology neutrality as well. The technology neutral approach to 2050 carbon neutrality can help reduce transition costs and increase feasibility of the target. Facing the dual challenges of power system reliability and climate mitigation, it would be worth reconsider the existing nuclear phase-out plan and increase the R&D support for CCUS technologies and exploration of storage reservoirs would also help increase the viability of carbon neutrality. And I would say, just as there is strong support for CO2 mitigation in the near term, there would also be need to equivalent support for longer term negative emissions technologies. So that is my final remark. Okay, now it's time for now it's time for our panel discussion. Deputy Minister Kim Bok-jung is online. Deputy Minister Kim, are you there online?
Okay, I'm here.
Yeah, could you
Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, hello, everybody. Thank you for having me at this conference, and I appreciate excellent presentations. First of all, I'd like to remind you of Korea's contributions at COP26. In Glasgow, Korea has made 3 promises to the international community. First, 40% of greenhouse gas emission reduction, including 30% methane reduction by 2030. Second, cooperation for international forest recovery and through inter-Korean forest cooperation, reducing emissions on the entire Korean peninsula. Third, joining global efforts to reduce coal use and completely ending coal-fired power generation by 2050. Considering challenging circumstances of Korea, such as high share of coal-fired power generation, the 40% is an ambitious target, but now is the time to turn words into action. Based on the Carbon Neutrality Act enacted last August, Korea will establish the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction roadmap to present a blueprint for 2050 net zero and 2030 target. To this end, government ministries are working together to develop various climate policies, from reducing emissions to laying institutional foundations. First is making deep emission cuts from emission incentive sectors. Coal power will be dramatically phased down from 40% to the low 20%, and renewable power will be scaled up significantly from 6.5% to 30%. Nuclear power will maintain the current level around 23% until 2030. But by 2050, the share will be lowered down to 6 to 7%. To reduce emission from industry sector, emissions trading scheme will be gradually strengthened. Also, we need to study more closely on how to replace the existing transportation and energy tax with carbon tax. Also, all the diesel cars will be scrapped early on. Instead, electric and hydrogen vehicles will be on the market in an increasing number. With the circular economy policies, organic waste and waste plastics will turn into biogas and refined oil. Second is promoting climate adaptation and just transition. The government established climate change adaptation framework plan every 5 years in different sectors, including water, forest, transportation, and agriculture. When it comes to just transition, community support centers are to be established to protect vulnerable areas and workers affected by climate crisis. The centers aim to attract investment and provide retraining and reemployment services. Third and last is creating enabling conditions for green transformation. The government plans to conduct climate impact assessment for major national plans and large-scale development projects before they're implemented. Carbon responsive budgeting is also to be newly introduced in government budgeting system. We'll also introduce Korean green taxonomy and promote green finance, such as investments in green bonds. We will improve R&D in technological innovations, focusing on top 10 core carbon neutral technologies in hard-to-abate sectors, such as green hydrogens and direct air capture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Kim, for sharing a perspective from the Ministry of Environment. And then he has emphasized, as you heard, the many important and enabling instruments to achieve carbon neutrality target. Now we also have other panelists, distinguished panelists, and the GTC President Jung. President Jung, would you share your opinion? You are muted. President Jung, you are muted. Yeah, now on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. As we have an interpreter, I'd like to use Korean for discussion, actually. 앞서 말씀하신 분이 이제 기술의 중요성, 기후 위기 대응과 탄소 중립에 있어서 기술의 중요성에
the
대해서
importance
말씀을
of technology in achieving carbon neutrality. Well, according to International Energy Agency, in order to achieve 2050, the technologies play a significant role. The currently commercially available technology as well as the future technology account for 80% of the contribution. And in renewable energy or the energy efficient technology advancement are needed to achieve carbon neutrality as well to further reduce the emissions. And we also need to electrify the end users as well as commercializing CCUS and other technologies. And for these sort of technologies, we need more R&D activities by the government. And I want to emphasize three things. We need R&D that is needed by the market. We have Korea R&D panel basis. And so despite the R&D investment, we have not been able to have a sufficient innovation. And so we excuse me, this is a Korean R&D paradox. We've had a sufficient discussion about the causes and the solutions to the paradoxes. We need to improve overall improvement in the R&D activities by the state. And we are trying to avoid short-term views. We are trying to have R&D activities that is more targeted for long term. And so we need to have a challenging, innovative R&D for carbon neutrality. And for that, we need some new challenging systems or the R&D activities. And I believe that such a technology can contribute to carbon neutrality. But that's for the mid to long term. In the short term, we need already available technologies. We need to be able to efficiently commercialize some of the R&D outputs. We need to use the convergence of the existing technologies to advance the existing technologies. That's what we need to do first. And second, we also need a region-led technological innovation. Well, they are important emitters. So we need to have localities and the regions participate in the reduction of emissions. And in the current carbon neutral basic plan, it says that the local government as well as the central government are the major actors or the players in reducing the emissions. So we do need to have plans for regional or the local governments, and we need to make sure that these local governments have the necessary resources and the capacities. And these plans, of course, need to incorporate the regional characteristics, and we need to have inventories of per region. And we also need to be able to share our resources, and we need to reform or we need to review the industry-wide and the region-wide projects. And so, as these projects are being conducted, we need to have R&D activities as well. And third, we need to have innovative ecosystem. So, with the universities, research centers, local government research centers, we need to form some sort of a consortiums to solve local and regional problems. And we need to provide support for those projects, and we also need to increase local acceptance. And we also need technological innovation in collaboration with the global community. Paris Accord stresses international cooperation in technology. Without international cooperation, the target for the carbon neutrality will be postponed by 40 or 50 years. And so international communities support for new standards and for new demonstration and pilot projects need to be implemented. And our 2030 NDC plans or the 2050 neutrality plan, where they do talk about the need for the international cooperation about the CCS and about supplying the hydrogen supply, securing, and all these and other the things are discussed. And so we need to have plans, and we need to work with international cooperation. So with the leading countries, we need to be able to share the technologies, and with such cooperation, it will be possible to reduce the cost for the development. And there are some countries that have similar industrial structure as Korea, and so we would need some sort of a strategic partnership with those countries. In terms of economy scale, and those countries that are more industrialized and have better economic structures, but still are deemed as developing countries. So we need to work very closely with those countries so that we can open up each other's market. Thank you very
President
much.
Chung. He has shared the importance of the promotion of high risk, high return research and development and region specific planning, and also the strategies and measurement issues as well, and international technology cooperation. And now I think he says this is a perfect balance because Deputy Minister actually shared his opinion about the policy instruments and measures. Now President Chung shares his opinion about the R&D investment. Now is our third important panelist, KAIST Professor Im Man-sung. Professor Im, could you share your insights?
Thank you, Chairman. It is my great pleasure and honor to be part of this great symposium. The issue of carbon neutrality is such an important matter, something that this generation of the global community must tackle and resolve for the future and sustainable growth of our mankind. But then, as many of us already noted, this is a huge challenge. Not a single approach, not a single technology can solve this problem. It's dealing with issues of human needs, human wants, and population growth, choice of technology, how to control release, how to capture the release. All those issues are part of this problem. But I think we heard very interesting talks from the presidential candidates earlier as part of this session, and we can see a very different approach to the problem. Part of the reason why they're talking about different approach is this energy sector in particular is an important part of this greenhouse gas reduction. Currently, according to 2020 report from global community, energy sector accounts for about 73% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So what we do with the energy sector is a huge factor in terms of how we achieve the carbon neutrality. And then depending on how you look at the energy issue, I think very different approaches can be considered. And right now, South Korea, for example, is going through this nuclear phase out energy transition, part of the, I think, historical development in energy transition as we noticed in other countries as well. But then I think one key issue here in our discussion is how we're going to look at the issue of intermittency of renewable energy. As Professor Um's presentation already pointed out, some of the issues, I think renewable energy is a dream of humankind. It is something we should tap into, something we can use without really utilizing on other resources. But at the same time, renewable energy, especially solar power and wind power, comes at its own cost. It has a very low energy density. Compared to nuclear power, the energy density is 10 to the 15th or 17th order of magnitude difference, meaning you need to have a huge infrastructure to cover the same amount of energy coming from a different source. Especially the intermittency issue of renewable energy. Sun doesn't shine all the time. Whenever there is a night, the sunlight goes out. Whenever the wind doesn't blow, the wind turbine doesn't rotate. So this wind intermittency, which cannot be well predicted right now, brings huge challenge and burden to the electric grid. So how are we going to handle that? Intermittency is a key issue. I think MIT's Energy Initiative report 2011 pointed out that the global community moved too fast with the penetration of renewable energy without considering the cost and consequences and implications. That's what we are talking about here. So right now, the intermittence of renewable energy means you have a difficulty in controlling the frequency. In energy generation, you have to have a perfect match between production and consumption. Without that, you will have a difficulty in maintaining quality of electricity, especially if you have a high penetration of renewable energy. There is something called balancing effect, meaning renewable energy is such a nice and cheap way to produce energy. Basically, all other energy sources will be reduced. Their generation portion will be reduced. So there is a basically balancing of this electricity, meaning other generating sources are not producing energy or reducing their producing energy. But then when sun goes out or wind goes out, suddenly there is a need to produce energy from other sources, and that's what we call a duck curve. South Korea is already noticing duck curve in Jeju Island. Many countries, Taiwan, Europe, Germany, or California, they're all experiencing this duck curve. The problem with South Korea is, in the case of California or Europe, they are connected with the other grids. So if you have a huge imbalance, you can import electricity from the neighboring grids. But in the case of South Korea, it is an island. We don't have a neighbor. We don't have a connection with other countries. Although we are talking about Northeast supergrid, the amount of electricity that will be shared will be very small. It's like 1 gigawatt, say, for example, with China. So this issue of balancing effect, the dirt curve, creates huge burden on the system, it potentially leading into system collapse. So that means you have to have a backup or storage. A backup right now, South Korea's policy is based on using natural gas. Natural gas is much better technology compared to coal, but it is still fossil fuel. It produces half of the greenhouse gases from coal, and it produces significant amount of fine particles, which is a huge problem in South Korea right now. And I think the issue of the storage is something that we want to achieve, but storage technology is not enough at the moment. The capacity of storage technologies cannot handle the electric grid demand at the moment. And the most reliable technology like battery is very expensive. I think if you're talking about storing 1 day use of electricity for 1 day in South Korea, you're talking about more than $600 billion. In lifetime of 15 years, it's about $48 billion. Yesterday, I was participating in a conference or workshop organized by National Academy of Engineering between South Korea and the United Kingdom. One of the speakers talked about the cost needed to produce the power grid to accommodate this intermittency and allow flexibility will be $733 billion per year. It's a huge cost that probably this country is not able to handle. And I think basically the battery expert from Germany, Dr. Frank Anders, he says energy transition without energy storage is technically impossible, and energy transition with energy storage system is economically impossible. So this indicates a huge challenge of going to decarbonization strategy with renewable energy only. Another challenge is system marginal price. With the increased use of renewable energy, right now, South Korea's system marginal price is like $0.50 per kilowatt hour, which is very low. This system marginal price is the wholesale electricity price. If the electricity producers cannot recover the cost, then they potentially have a bankruptcy. This was happening in UK in the 2002. So South Korea's energy market is potentially heading toward energy market collapse if continued growth of renewable energy leads into further decrease in the system marginal price, something we don't really talk about. This means we have to have a different approach. And I'm a nuclear engineer, but I'm not necessarily just promoting nuclear power. We have to have a sort of a phased approach and sort of a symbiotic approach. What is the low carbon energy? As already mentioned by some of the speakers, it's renewable energy and nuclear power. People talking about nuclear power and renewable as a competition or some sort of adversary, but we should find a way to have a sort of a symbiotic relationship. You should help each other. It is not a competition. It is a harmony. It is a hybrid energy system toward the future, sustainable growth. So I think earlier, one of the presidential candidates said SMR is not a solution because it's going to take a long time. But I think right now, the current large reactors can also participate in this picture. Large reactors are currently used in other countries for cogeneration, for desalination, for district heating, or for this industry heat production. Basically, the electricity produced from nuclear power can also be used as excess electricity to produce hydrogen. In our research group, we have also done some economics analysis. Using excess electricity, can we produce hydrogen in economic manner? Answer is almost there. Economics almost there. And also excess electricity from nuclear power can also be used to charge electric cars. So there is no really need to go for other sources when we have already enough energy infrastructure to produce electricity for excess electricity. I think SMR, can be also a great way in the future for harmonious hybrid energy system, for distributed energy system, but I will not dwell on that. So my point is, there is a way to have this collaborative relationship between renewable energy and nuclear power to address this decarbonization challenge. One related issue is the public acceptance with the nuclear power, obviously, the fear associated with nuclear power, the issue with nuclear waste, but those issues can be handled, as an example, in countries like Finland, Sweden, UK, United States. Those countries were able to handle those challenges, social challenges. So we have precedents that we can follow, we can learn from. And hopefully through this harmonious symbiotic utilization of energy sources, I think we can better handle the challenge of decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Im. Thank you so much for sharing your important insights. Turning carbon neutrality into action actually requires for us a different gear. We need to be very much serious and very much realistic. We can no longer be hopeful anymore. So in that regard, Professor Im's comment is very well taken. Our next panelist is BNEF Asia head Izadi. Ali Izadi, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking the Seoul Climate Energy Conference for giving me this opportunity. If I may, in the interest of time, I will keep my comments focused on policies. I believe you've already heard quite a lot of interesting views around technology choices for achieving carbon neutrality. If I may, I would like to begin by highlighting the importance of recognizing we cannot solve challenges that are primarily around market design with technology innovation. We can debate a lot whether renewables are better or nuclear or the combination of those, but fundamentally, if you don't have the right energy market, you're not going to be able to actually reduce emissions fast enough. In Korea, the last time there was significant energy market reform was back in 2000, back when President Kim Dae-jung was in power. So the Electricity Industry Restructuring Act was passed in 2000, and the major impact of that was in 2001 when we had the KEPCO subsidiary set up and then the Korea Power Exchange. Unfortunately, by the time President Roh took power, the energy market reform slowed down, and ever since then, we haven't seen any significant changes. And the challenge that we have today under the current market structure in the power sector, we don't have the right signals to investors, to consumers, to facilitate the energy transition that needs to happen. I was a little bit, if I may say, a little bit displeased that none of the presidential candidates are willing to actually talk about fundamental energy market reform. Yes, they all have their technology choices, but no one is really willing to take on what fundamentally is needed. If you look at the current debate, it's a little bit unfortunate that, for example, there is a proposal in the National Assembly right now to actually allow Korea Electric Power Corporation, KEPCO, get back into direct investments in power generation. Fair enough, we do need more investment in renewables, but actually this misses the entire point of the last rounds of reform that happened 20 years ago. It would be, and I do apologize, some of you who may have seen me at other conferences over the last 10 years, you may have heard this message before. If Korea really wants to accelerate decarbonization of the power sector, it needs to be willing to fundamentally reform the energy market. And a really good model of that is studying the EU third energy package and how EU took on that. It doesn't mean that KEPCO doesn't have a role. KEPCO has a fundamental role, but more competition and transparency on the generation and the retail side is extremely important. The second comment I have is around the Korea emission trading scheme. So Korea was well ahead of its Asian peers in introducing a carbon cap and trade mechanism. If you Before the KTS, of course, there was the TMS as well. So almost a decade of experience with carbon cap and trade. The challenge, as Professor Kim Sang-yeop showed us in his opening remarks, if you look at the amount of emission reductions that Korea has managed, so during the phase 1 of KTS, there was almost no reduction. Phase 2, to be fair, has been a little bit more promising, and now we are at the beginning of phase 3. The main challenge is there's simply too many free allowances. If you give the carbon credits for free, obviously you're not going to have an emission reduction benefit of that. So under phase 3, particularly given the new 2030 emission reduction target, the next government has to really relook at it and reconsider the free allowances that are put in there. The last comment that I have is around public funding. Now, we heard from Vice Minister Park as well as Deputy Minister Kim, and then certainly among OECD countries, the Korean government, under successive administrations, if you go back to President Lee Myung-bak, for example, under Green Growth, under President Park, and under President Moon, there has been really good public funding for energy transition. Unfortunately, it hasn't been very efficient from a prioritization perspective. So for example, for about a decade, Korea has been subsidizing stationary fuel cell power plants that are using natural gas. Those fuel cell power plants have no emission reduction benefit. Actually, if you run that natural gas through a combined cycle gas turbine, you get a better emission profile than running them on a fuel cell, stationary fuel cell power plant. So ensuring that the public funding is going first to hard to abate sectors that really need that funding is important. As our chairman, Professor Ohm, mentioned, for example, prioritizing funding for CCS or technologies such as DAX, which really need public funding, is critical. Similarly, looking at new nuclear technologies like SMR, again, those are areas that really public funding is crucial because the private sector on its own will not be able to fund it. The other element of it is in sectors where the technology is already mature, it's already ready for deployment. For example, when it comes to passenger electric vehicles, no longer subsidies are necessary. Here, it's about regulations. If you look at China as well as the European Union, they're already reaching higher levels of EV adoption than Korea, even though they have, particularly in the case of China, far lower subsidies. And actually, China pretty much for certain segments has already phased out those subsidies. But they have very strong regulations in place in the form of, in the case of EU emission standards, or in the case of China, in the form of the new energy vehicle standards. So this is another thing to be very conscious of. You don't need to subsidize. Actually, if you try to subsidize your way to carbon neutrality, you will never be able to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali Zadi. Thank you for your insights. Especially, I like the you mentioned about the fundamentals. So the target is very challenging, and we need to go back to our fundamentals. What is fundamentals to us? The fundamental is market. So we need to get the prices right. We need to let the markets work. So those are the things that the current government should address quite very rapidly, I guess. So our last discussant is SA4C Solutions for Our Climate Director Kim Joo-jin. Kim Joo-jin, Director Kim, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much.
Could you share?
I have my slide up. I hope everybody sees. It's above all, it's very grateful to be here. Thank you very much to KAIST and Inclusions for a Common Future to inviting me. I also appreciate the efforts that Vice Minister Park or Deputy Minister Kim will have exercised during the update of our NDC. As many know, our NDC, I think also mentioned in the presentation earlier, our NDC, the power sector seems to be the most important component of our NDC. And in 2030, the NDC envisions that we will have 22% of coal power and 30% in renewables. Science says, and also endorsed by the IEA recently, says that OECD nations will have to phase out coal by 2030. And KAIST research that Dr. just shared right now says that in order to be carbon neutral, we will have to have at least 40% of renewables by 2030. Unfortunately, our NDT doesn't say that, and I think that comes from lack of confidence within our government about renewables. I think there are two reasons that happens. Number one, fears about social acceptance, and number two, concerns about the reliability of renewable energy. I think Dr. Lim also mentioned a little bit about that during his presentation. I would like to go into those two problems and see whether that's actually a problem or if that's something that we could easily reform. I believe the problem of, I think 30% of our lack of confidence of renewables, 1/3 of our lack of confidence in renewables is about bad construction permitting policy. We are not using the right construction permitting policies or offshore maritime policies needed for renewables. And I think the PV, the problem that the PV industry, the photovoltaic industry is experiencing, especially with siting renewable power plants, solar power plants, is a very good example. We did a study last year showing how much land will be available under the siting regulations that are national, subnational, forestry regulations, and will make available. And according to our research, if you overlap all the layers of siting regulations that our government, subnational governments, and forestry service imposes on PV development, in many cases, in many counties, in many municipalities, you only have less than 1% of the land available for renewable development, PV development. The reason why this happens is basically our national government has delegated too much authority to our subnational governments, despite the industrial importance of renewable development. Because of that reason, we have almost 200 sets of different PV permitting schemes. The way we resolve this, easy. We are a very centralized nation. A lot of our policy is centralized. Why is PV an exception here? Our government has to go in and organize this situation. They have to preempt. They have to kind of impose limitations on what kind of things that the subnational governments can do. Because if you don't do that, subnational governments are very much exposed to the political pressure from residents. They have smaller voting pools. And one village talking about renewables in the wrong way exposes the subnational governments to a lot of pressure. And that's not right. It's not politically right. It's not right from a social justice perspective. And I think the same problems exist in onshore wind projects and offshore wind projects. There's just too vast extent of delegation to provincial governments, and our national government has to come in and preempt some of that authority. And I think if I were to have to say one thing to the president of Korea about climate, I would tell him, Mr. President, the way to exercise climate leadership is not going out and saying it, giving a good NDC. It's going into the details and organizing this mess here, organizing this construction permitting mess. And I think with this, we will have a lot of renewable. I also very much agree with Mr. Ali Azadi's points about our energy market. And I think the Jeju case, what's happening in Jeju Island really, really well represents the problems of our power sector. In Jeju, as many know, wind power projects are experiencing 3 to 4% curtailment of its power production. Jeju is also an interconnected grid, and they are sending up power produced in Jeju province up to the mainland. It's interconnected, but still these problems occur. Jeju has an average load of about 600 megawatts, and it already has 800 megawatts of wind plus solar power plants. So theoretically, it's possible to make Jeju 100% renewables. Actually, it's very common to see Jeju operating on renewables 60% of Jeju's power mix to be renewables during the day. At the same time, Jeju has 900 megawatts of gas, diesel, oil power plants. And all of these plants are owned by KEPCO. Meanwhile, the renewable energy side is different. Solar and wind power plants are private. There's also KEPCO-related plants. It has a different merit mix. So if the capacity factor of gas plants or oil plants go up, KEPCO earns a lot of money. If the capacity factors of wind and solar power plants go up, KEPCO loses money because the energy used in Jeju Island is the same. There are technical solutions to curtailment. And I know I know that it's not a difficult. It's technologies that the EU have been using. The US has been using for the past 10 years. Real-time intraday markets, flexible power markets, battery systems, feed-in premiums, virtual power plants. Those are all available as technical solutions to the situation we have. Nevertheless, why? Why does the people of Jeju say about why does curtailment happen, and why aren't these technologies deployed in Jeju? And I think on that point, we have a very serious energy sector governance problem. What happens? I'm not sure whether everybody knows about the concept of a grid system operator. The Korea Power Exchange is our grid system operator, and what they do is basically do the balancing of our grid. Why are these technical solutions that I mentioned right now are not available despite the availability? First of all, let's think about who will lose money if the renewable power plants are curtailed less and fossil fuel generators curtailed more. As I mentioned, renewables have a mixed ownership structure, but the fossil fuel power plants in Jeju are 100% KEPCO. So if renewable power plants are curtailed less, have a higher capacity factors than now, Korea Electric Power Corporation, KEPCO, will lose money. Then who decides the reliability standards applied to the grid, including whether or not to introduce real-time intraday markets or compensate battery services, or how to compensate battery services? It's the Korea Power Exchange, as I mentioned. Korea Power Exchange is our national grid system operator. Korea Power Exchange was established to become an independent system operator. It was benchmarking what the PJM, KAISO of the US was doing. These are independent system operators. So independent system operators should be neutral to technology. But will that be happening? And what happens if KEPCO holds majority of KEPCO member meeting voting rights and substantial presence in the KPX boardroom? Because KEPCO does have more than majority of the KPX member meeting rights, and it also has multiple seats in the boardroom of the Korea Power Exchange. What happens? Obviously, it's going to be very difficult for the Korea Power Exchange to be technologically neutral. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Korea Power Exchange to suggest technical alternatives that will detrimentally affect the cash flow of KEPCO. KEPCO may say that we're a very fair organization, but even fair governments also have concerns when it comes to losing their seats and losing their opportunities. It's a very sensitive issue to KEPCO. And will KPX be able to say what they need to say when it does affect KEPCO's business? I think no. And I think the same thing is happening not just in Jeju, but nationally and also regionally. Korea's energy regulators, Dr. Kim, Deputy Minister Kim, has been probably saying that we have a reliability problem. But let's think about where you get that reliability related information. It's probably from KEPCO, and there is a conflict of interest when you look into KEPCO and decide that we have a reliability problem. There is the information that sometimes our government relies on here may be tainted. That's my concern.
Mm-mm. Okay. Yeah.
My last point is about this was my improvisation after listening to the presidential candidate speech. I wanted to show this data to show where nuclear stands in the world energy industry. This comes from a rather outdated IEA report that it annually puts out. You can see the light blue line there, which represents new investments in nuclear. And this is what we are debating about, whether this small sliver of nuclear is our future or not. But look at the green part. That's where the money is going into, and that's where the future of our economy is. And it's kind of disappointing to see that a big chunk of our discussion on energy is not focused on this green part, but on the sky blue part. So thank you very much, and once again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the director, Kim. Thank you for sharing your insights and also the problems we are facing now in our pursuit of carbon neutrality. So because of time limitations, we cannot have a long discussion here from now on. So instead, let me ask one question to to all of you if you wanted to speak, comment on that. So it seems that in order to turn this carbon neutrality into action, I think probably our government should play a different role than they had so far in Korea. So how would you comment on that? So should they play a different role, and what role? And should they decrease its role or increase its role, and so forth? Maybe Deputy Minister Kim, could you comment on that? Or maybe Dr. Jung, or maybe Professor Im? Yep.
Okay, thank you for your question about role of government. I think government is important to get net zero by 2050. And so we have to focus kind of supporting technology innovation, social innovation, and financing. But anyway, have you heard about Chinese environmentalist? If we lose our weight, we have to diet eagerly and kind of exercise, not just doing take of our health. So we have to move toward green transformation, and all of us we have to do our part. So a part of from government effort and industries, so civil societies and academics will have work together toward carbon neutrality. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to take one last comments from other panelists, if you have. Any comments about the new role of government, if possible? Professor
If I
Im?
may?
Yep.
Yes. I think I agree with the last panelist point about the market and the systems issue, and also our speaker, Ali Azad. But I think the issue with the South Korea's market system is there are a lot of laws to support or promote this, but they are not connected. There is no centralized, unified control tower to push for this development. And it's very hard to pull those issues together to make something happening. So I think there should be more government leadership in making these things happening. At the same time, I think there is a strong need, a drive for the decentralized, deregulated market in South Korea. But that at the same time is not necessarily a panacea. Many countries who have gone through this decentralization having difficulties. I think UK is, for example. I think it's country-specific issue. We have to be very careful, maybe a balance between centralized versus decentralized market to be able to meet the needs and specificity of South Korea, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Im. I think it's time to conclude. Now we have had a very interesting discussion and presentations so far. We have talked about the critical technology options for carbon neutrality, which includes renewable sources and hydrogen, and also nuclear. And also we talked about the technology R&D, and then how to prioritize hard to abate and high risk and high return sector investment in R&D. And also some of the panelists, actually I think we all share the same idea, same opinion, I guess, is how to restart market reforms, especially state-owned enterprises in particular, to attract private investment and competition, which I think is very important. And policy instruments also needs to be well devised that is compatible with our carbon neutrality ambition, and that is to be made very soon, and then in the form of KETS or some other policy instruments. With that, let me finish our plenary, second plenary right now. Thank you so much for joining our talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your presentations and discussions, which truly contextualize the process of turning carbon neutrality into action. There was the importance and emphasis placed on difficult sectors such as agriculture and buildings, as well as intermittency involved with green energy technologies, but also solutions mentioned such as greater energy storage, green hydrogen, and effective climate leadership. Thank you all again.